All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started as people join us. Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. It's so good to see you all on the screen. I am Angie Pilgrim, Director of Community Impact here at the St. Croix Valley Foundation, and today I'm stepping in for our sniffling and sneezing and wonderful President Heather Loughlin. On behalf of the St. Croix Valley Foundation and our generous sponsor and longtime partner, First State Bank and Trust, I am delighted to welcome you to our Conversations of the Valley. This is a community forum hosted by the St. Croix Valley Foundation, and we've been doing this since 2004. So the mission of the St. Croix Valley Foundation is to enhance the quality of life in the St. Croix Valley. And we do that by encouraging and supporting charitable giving, connecting people in programs, and encouraging collaboration. It's that last part of our mission, collaboration, bringing together individuals and organizations to find solutions to shared community concerns. That's what these Conversations of the Valley are all about. Getting people together to learn, to talk, and to think about how we may respond to current and emerging issues. The theme of this year's series is placemaking. My guess is that a majority of you are here today because you are passionate about the St. Croix Valley, this place that we are lucky to call home, even on a dreary day like today. Some of you have deep roots in the valley, roots that may even go back generations, and others are new to the valley, choosing the St. Croix Valley as the place you call home. Some of you may be connected throughout the valley and others to one specific community. Whatever the case, you recognize that what we have here is really special. At the January kickoff of our placemaking series, we heard from Dr. Catherine Laughlin, the city doctor, and lead consultant of the Knight Foundation Soul of the Community Research. By the way, if you missed any of the previous sessions, you can find those recordings on the St. Croix Valley Foundation website. So Dr. Laughlin set the stage for this series by explaining what is placemaking and how does attachment to place relate to economic growth and opportunity. In February, John Robert from Smart Growth America presented the built environment. Smart Growth America defines the built environment as what we build, where and how we build it, and whom we build it for. John Robert presented several success stories on how the built environment contributes to attachment to place and advances economic development. Then in March, we heard from a panel comprised of representatives from University of Minnesota Extension and the International Institute of Minnesota on building welcoming communities. That knowledgeable panel addressed important questions, including who is coming to our region, why is it important to build welcoming communities, and how does that contribute to economic vitality? Now, as we learned from Dr. Laughlin in that very first session, the three factors that contribute to attachment to place include aesthetics, social offerings, and being open and welcoming. Now, just take a minute to think about your favorite artist or arts organization and the important work that they do centered on placemaking and those three factors. There's no question that today's presentation on creative placemaking really ties up this series with a beautiful bow. So today we're going to learn more about the role the arts play in economic growth, transforming neighborhoods, and connecting people to place. Now, before I introduce today's speakers, a couple reminders about today's Zoom format, though I'm guessing you're all getting very familiar. We have muted all participants, so there's no interruptions. And as you know, if you put Zoom on speaker view, your screen will be filled with our lovely speakers, or you can go to gallery view and scroll through the attendees. We do hope to have time for questions at the end. So if you do have questions that come up, just type those into the chat box and we'll address those at the end of the session. And now I am honored and pleased to introduce our two speakers. Jen Hughes is the Director of Design and Creative Placemaking for the National Endowment for the Arts, NEA. In this position, she oversees grant portfolios that support the design and creative placemaking fields, including the Our Town program, as well as agency initiatives that include the Mayor's Institute on City Design and the Citizens Institute on Rural Design. At the NEA, she has managed federal, philanthropic, and local relationships to strategically integrate the arts, culture, and design into comprehensive community development plans. Trained as an urban planner, she is passionate about the role the arts and culture can play in advancing the well-being of communities and people. And then Laura Zabel is the Executive Director of Springboard for the Arts, an economic and community development agency run by and for artists. Springboard provides programs that help artists make a living and a life, and programs that help communities connect to the creative power of artists. Springboard is a nationally recognized leader in artist-led community development, creative placemaking, and cross-sector collaboration. Springboard's work directly impacts over 20,000 artists each year through their free toolkits, training, and resources. Springboard's programs have been replicated in over 100 communities across the US and internationally. Now, as you can tell, I could go on and on about both speakers. They're just fabulous. But Jen and Laura, thank you so much for being with us today. And I'll now turn it over to you. Jen, I'm going to ask you to unmute. There we go.
Great. Thank you so much, Angie and Heather and the whole St. Croix Valley Foundation team for inviting us here today for this creative placemaking conversation. I'm so excited to be presenting alongside Laura Zabel, who I've long admired as a national leader, doer, thinker on this topic. So I think you're going to be in for a great treat. So as Angie mentioned, just a little bit about me. I am trained as an urban planner and entered the NEA 11 years ago at a moment in time when we were advancing a really exciting new grant portfolio called the Our Town Creative Placemaking Grant Program. So I'm really excited to share a little bit about that, kind of take you through a whirlwind of some projects across the country. And I'm just really excited also to learn from all of you and hear what's happening across the region. Minnesota certainly holds a very dear and special place in my heart. I have some wonderful family out there, and just oftentimes I'm lifting up the incredible work that's happening in the state around arts and culture wherever I go. So I will share my presentation, also start my timer. Just give me a minute here. Okay. All right, so my contact information is up there. Feel free to be in touch with any follow-up. Happy to entertain that beyond the session today. So I wanted to just orient you and bring you wishes from our recently sworn in chair, Maria Rosario Jackson. And for those of you who don't know much about the NEA, just wanted to give you a 2-second overview. So we are a federal funding agency that supports arts and culture. We offer direct competitive grant making, execute partnerships, conduct research around the arts and cultural sector, and lead national initiatives. 40% of our funding goes to our state arts agencies, 6 regional arts agencies, and US territories to really extend the reach of the work that we do. And 60% of our funding goes to direct competitive grant projects. We are staff primarily based in Washington, DC. That's certainly changed over the years, over the last 2 years during the pandemic. But if you're interested in learning more, just going to leave you with this teaser to learn a bit more about any of our grant funding programs. We have deadlines throughout the year. We support 1 to 2 year competitive project grants where nonprofit 501c3 organizations, government entities, and federally recognized tribal governments can apply for funding. But we're really here to talk about creative placemaking. So I think it's just been really long understood that arts and design can beautify a place and attract new residents. And annually, the arts and culture sector contributes significantly to our national GDP. 4.2% in 2020, despite substantial economic losses since the onset of the pandemic to the arts and culture sector. This also has enormous contributions in terms of 5 million wage and salary workers to the workforce, and recent joint research study by the US Department of Agriculture and the National Endowment for the Arts, we learned how significant the arts and culture sector is in contributing to rural innovation. But today, I really hope to expand your imagination on the role that artists, designers, and culture bearers can play in advancing key priorities in your local communities. Communities large and small are rich in artists, and they can help to do many different things. Illuminate, bring new attention to, or elevate key community assets and issues, voices of residents, local histories, or cultural infrastructure. They can help to energize, injecting new or additional energy, resources, activity, people, or enthusiasm to a place. They can help to imagine. Really, I think this is most appropriate at this moment in time that we find ourselves in envisioning new possibilities for a community or place, a new future, a new way of overcoming challenges or approaching problem solving on the local level. And lastly, we are really deeply desiring connection after 2 years of isolation. So think of the arts and cultural actors in your community as helping to connect people, places, economic opportunity via physical spaces or new relationships. So it's just a little bit of history around creative placemaking, and also I think it's worth defining how the NEA defines creative placemaking, acknowledging that Knight Foundation's Soul of the City, taking us back 11 or so years, really was the impetus for the work that the NEA started to establish creative placemaking grant program. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But when the NEA talks about creative placemaking, we're talking about the integration of arts, culture, and design activities in efforts to strengthen local communities. So that's really with the goal of helping to achieve a community's desired outcome. For some places, that might be attraction and retention of residents. And in other cases, it might be combating displacement due to rising housing costs and cost of living. So context really matters in this work. So a couple key tenets of the NEA's definition of creative placemaking and what we really lift up in the Our Town program is that this is really asset-based work, really building on the strengths of a local place, the histories, the stories, the people, the artists that are there in your communities, those culture bearers. Creative placemaking is all about facilitating cross-sector partnerships. So think about a cultural institution partnering with a public health department or a transportation department to forward a particular community priority. This work requires deep and inclusive community engagement, often led by the community, perhaps facilitated by artists or designers. And the creative in the term creative placemaking is really about centering the transformative role of artists, designers, and culture bearers in this work. So I just want to lift up, creative placemaking can be a process. It doesn't have to always just be focused on resulting in a physical artifact or a product. So we're really talking about project work that is setting communities up for transformational change. And our orientation is towards driving local outcomes that are responsive to community issues. That could be economic, could be physical, could be social, or it could really be navigating towards a larger scale systems change. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So at the NEA, our definition is intentionally open and broad because creative placemaking draws on all artistic disciplines and can be deployed as a strategy to address a wide range of communities, issues, or challenges, from public health to public safety, economic development to housing. And in a moment, I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour of projects the NEA has funded in creative placemaking through the Our Town grant program. So just to give you a little bit of a snapshot there, over the last 11 years, the Our Town program has funded over 600 projects all across the country, distributed over $45 million. And you can take a look at all of these projects for inspiration, ideas, folks to connect to on our website at arts.gov. All of our grants are viewable to the public. So let's take a quick tour to kind of expand and tease your imagination on what creative placemaking can look like in different contexts across the country. So first, taking you to Wenatchee, Washington. In 2017, the NEA supported a resident-driven creative placemaking process for the Kiwanis Methow Park in Wenatchee. So this project was really focused on community workshops to help design and inform a public gathering space for a 1.2 acre park that was really the heartbeat of the community. So they were looking to do a series of activities over the 2 years that would ultimately result in some murals, some really fantastic public space design to facilitate a local farmers market, and also bring together community development stakeholders. So what happened is this really set the community on the path of not just resulting in a physical, beautiful space, but engaging artists in this creative facilitation process that really built civic collective power and resulted in some incredible community infrastructure in the form of a local community organization that ultimately took on the stewardship of the park and so much more. And this is the type of really critical infrastructure that is key in communities to help vulnerable populations to be really responsive, particularly in this moment of the pandemic. Let's go down to Puerto Rico and San Juan. This project, Imagine Santurce, was a creative asset mapping and cultural district planning process. And oftentimes that's a great way for communities to get started, to collect the stories, histories, people, rituals, and things that really make a place what it is. So this project was really about making visible that civic infrastructure, that arts and cultural heritage that existed in all places. You can see this is an outdoor performance that isn't taking place in a theater on a stage, but right there in the community. And what's so compelling about some of the projects that took place in Santurce with NEA funding was that, as you know, a couple of years ago, Hurricane Maria moved throughout the community. And this creative asset mapping process really provided the kind of infrastructure and support and information to help rebuild and to help articulate that the arts and cultural sector had to be invested in. So these are great ways to kind of get your community started on thinking about where it might head in the future and taking stock of all the special treasures and treasured people that exist in your community. So in Savannah, creative placemaking looks like this project, Block by Block, which was a year-long creative writing program offered by the Deep Center, which is a Savannah-based nonprofit in partnership with the Savannah-Chatham County Public School System. So students went out into the community, again, to collect stories, to do writings, to lead a whole series of public activities over the course of 2 years, both developing and honing their writing skills, but also lifting up narratives of their place and beginning to shift the narrative and understanding of all the great things that were happening there. In Austin, Forklift Dance Works partnered with the City of Austin Aquatics Department on a really exciting project, My Park, My Pool. The NEA funded, I think, 3 years of this program activity, which was really meant to bring attention to the crumbling infrastructure of the pool systems. These were beloved jewels in the community, but the city just didn't have the resources to keep up the maintenance. So creative choreographers sort of bonded and connected with city park staff to really help bring attention to the narrative and importance of this place. And just fast forwarding, you know, these types of creative actors help to galvanize an incredible spirit and enthusiasm and ultimately advocacy that led to a bond measure that reinvested over $150 million into the parks system. So these are the types of results that could really come from creative placemaking initiatives and centering the role of artists as catalysts in your community. So let's go to Indianapolis. This might look like pre-enactment theater led by the Harrison Center in partnership with the City of Indianapolis, where there was a focus on the Manon neighborhood to really imagine or pre-enact what their future might look like. You might be familiar with reenactment theater. This was projecting out into the future. And so the creative placemaking work culminated in a weekends-long festival that really brought the community together, but it was ultimately the result of a 1.5-year planning process to bring community stakeholders together, to start to come together to imagine design upgrades locally, imagine ways that the built environment could be beautified, creative entrepreneurs could be resourced in the vacant storefronts. So this was a really exciting project that has had long legs beyond the life of the NEA funding. In Eagle Butte, South Dakota, it might look like supporting artist residencies and a Native Youth Arts Fellowship at the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation. So this was a really exciting project led by the Cheyenne River Youth Project that was focused on helping to build the connection between youth living on the reservation and Lakota culture by practicing art and making it really visible in public spaces where the community gathered. In Eastern Coachella Valley, California, Kunkui Design Initiative in partnership with the Desert Recreation District, artists were engaged and deployed all across this small agricultural community to collect stories and places of importance to ultimately inform the design of the area's very first public gathering space. So this was a really exciting grassroots project, which culminated in a public gathering space, but was really reflective of the community culture and helped to integrate some of those ideas into some of the longer term district's infrastructure plans. And taking us to Minnesota, in Granite Falls, population 1,300, it could look like an artist residency program for the city to build relationships and connections with its constituents. And this is really where artists can play an incredible role as creative problem solvers, creative connectors with community, and also to really translate city-led initiatives and projects and sort of connect the dots with the local community members. And I would say this is a project that certainly I can imagine lots of other rural communities potentially one day emulating. So speaking of Minnesota, there is so much work happening in communities throughout your wonderful state. And so I just lifted up a snapshot of a few current Our Town grant-making projects that the NEA is supporting. There are several more active Minnesota projects that I could feature here, but I thought I would give you a teaser of that just to show the multiple forms that creative placemaking might be in your community. So I think, interestingly enough, we ask our grantees to really articulate how they intend to strengthen their community. And they do it in many different ways. Some communities may articulate a desire for economic change, so driving local business growth, whereas others might be focused on making permanent long-term transformation to the physical or built environment in a place. And there are others that are really focused on social change, recognizing that improvements to social relationships, civic engagement, and building collective community power can really help to drive longer term initiatives in a place. So I lift up this social change element because I think if you were to rewind 12 years ago and reflect on the state of creative placemaking, it was really focused as an initiative to drive economic impact locally. But I think there are multiple benefits that can come from these projects, and this is also a really important one to think about. So I want to leave you with just a couple of resources. If you want to learn more about what we've been thinking about, what our grantees have been doing, want to get started on your own creative placemaking initiatives, I want to send you over to a toolkit that we've been developing and building with LISC, the Local Initiative Support Corporation. So I have the website here. It's a lot of like how-to guides on setting up partnerships, how to think about inclusive and deep community engagement. Lots of great videos, podcasts, worksheets. So you might want to just peruse if you're thinking about things in your local community. Also, I would be remiss without lifting up this Creative Placemaking Values Guide. This was created several years ago now through really a thoughtful consortium of partners, as well as reaching out to field practitioners in creative placemaking. And I think it's a guide that offers a lot of great questions for you to consider as you are thinking of embarking on a creative placemaking project. And lastly, over the years, the NEA has invested in the development of toolkits, resources, conferences, things to really build the field of creative placemaking. Springboard for the Arts is certainly a national leader in this work. So I lifted up the Artists Working in Community handbook that they have. Also, you might be thinking about what could creative placemaking look like at the intersection of transportation as your communities are investing in infrastructure. Are there ways to make sure that there is deep and inclusive, equitable engagement with your local communities on these large-scale infrastructure projects? And how can artists be deployed both in the process and delivery of better designed infrastructure? So there's a lot of other great stuff up here, but we'll be sure to send out the links and the presentations. And if you were to walk away with one thing, I just hope it is in imagining the multiple ways that artists, designers, and culture bearers can be activated in your community as creative problem solvers, as catalysts for advancing local priorities on everything from economic development to building civic power. So with that, I'm so pleased to turn it over to dear friend, Laura Zabel.
Thanks, Jen. That was so great. It's just always such a pleasure to get to talk about these ideas with Jen and with the NEA and the leadership that the National Endowment has provided in kind of forwarding the ideas around creative placemaking in the field, and the national network has been so helpful to Springboard's work, and I know to so many communities across the country. We're super grateful for that. And it's so nice to have that kind of broad introduction of what the work can look like in so many different contexts and different places. I'm going to share a little bit about what our work looks like here in Minnesota, some local examples for you, and talk a little bit about how Springboard thinks about creative placemaking and thinks about the role of artists in community development and in social and economic and community change. So I'm going to take a minute here to share my screen. All right. So as you've heard several times already, I'm Laura Zabel. I'm the Executive Director of Springboard for the Arts. Springboard is a nonprofit organization that's based in Minnesota. Our work is really place-based, and we're based in here where I am today in St. Paul, Minnesota. That's where our urban office is. And then we have a rural office in Fergus Falls, Minnesota. Both of those communities are on land that was and is the homeland of the Dakota and Ojibwe people. And I think particularly when we're talking about work that is place-based and culturally rooted, it's really important to understand the context that that work happens in and the many people who have contributed their culture and their creativity to those places through the generations and through the life of that land. Springboard's work is really about art as meaning making. So like Jen was saying, we also have a very broad definition of what art is and who artists are. So we consider art as meaning making in everyday life. And so that demands a really broad definition of who artists are, who artists and culture bearers and tradition bearers are. And in particular, Springboard's work focuses on and prioritizes artists who have not historically been resourced by the existing arts systems, and in many cases for whom they have been extracted from. So specifically for us, that means we prioritize artists who are Black, Indigenous and Native, artists who are people of color or immigrant and refugee artists, artists with disabilities, artists in rural communities and underinvested urban neighborhoods, and artists who identify as GLBTQIA. And our work, I think, sits at all of these different intersections and is filled with things that I think sometimes feel like contradictions to other people, but are really, I think, the assets for Springboard. So what I mean by that is Springboard is an organization that is both urban and rural. We are really place-based, but also really interested in system change and how ideas from specific places can travel into larger systems and impact the policies and the systems around us. And our work is deeply practical, really focused on the delivering of resources or building out really practical resources, but also everything that Springboard does, no matter how small, we try to imagine it as a metaphor and a symbol for how things could be different for the world that we're trying to make. Our vision looks like this. We really think about these interconnected ways of working that we do hold artists and culture bearers as essential, and that is a part of how we build vibrant and just local economies and contribute to system change to make our systems more human-centered, and the inverse, that we need human-centered systems and vibrant and just local economies in order to value our artists and culture bearers. Another way to think about the kind of metaphor of what Springboard does is that we think of artists as a natural resource. Artists exist in every community, on every block, in every neighborhood, and they are a natural resource and a source of power. We call that creative people power, and communities can get so much by tapping into that power, but just like other natural resources, we need the systems that make it possible for us to plug into that resource. So if you imagine you can have a very sunny community, but not have access to solar power unless someone builds the solar panels. And Springboard is a solar panel organization. So the sun already exists, artists already exist. Our job at Springboard is to help tend and care for that natural resource to make it more sustainable, and to help people tap into it, to really build the infrastructure that helps make those connections between the artist community and the creative people in a place and all of those other sectors, like Jen was talking about, public health and in the environment and community development and the economy, to make those connections more visible and easier for people to work across those sectors. What this looks like in practicality, in terms of what our programs look like, are programs that really directly help artists make a living and a life, and then those programs that are about what does the community get back if we have a healthy artist community. And there's really, unfortunately, no better example of what that looks like or the need for that kind of support work than the last 2 years. Over the last 2 years, as you know, if we can, I'm sure I'll remember back to March of 2020, for many parts of our community, and in particular for the artist community, the bottom just really fell out, and people really had access to very little safety net or support. If you think about artists who teach in the schools, artists who work in elder care, artists who are doing community events, artists who are performers or whose work is event-based, just all avenues for support and their livelihood were shut down. So over the last 2 years, Springboard has scaled our existing emergency relief fund to support over 3,000 artists in Minnesota alone with emergency stopgap financial support. We also wrote a toolkit for how to start an emergency relief fund and helped about 80 cities across the country stand up emergency relief resources for their creative communities. And we did that because we knew that in crisis, not only are these individual human people in our community who obviously need to be able to feed their families and pay rent, but that we were going to need artists in these moments of crisis. We need artists for their imagination, for their creativity, for their ability to connect. So as we were doing that kind of emergency relief, direct support of artists, we've also been really focused on how do we create the mechanisms for artists to help their communities during the crises of the last 2 years. So here are some examples of what that looks like. In the days immediately after George Floyd was murdered here in Minneapolis, We supported a group of 10 Black artists in Frogtown and Rondo in St. Paul to do projects that were in partnership and with small business owners who were, for many reasons, worried about their spaces and their neighborhood, and also as a way for Black artists to try and reclaim the narrative of what was happening here to our community and in our community, and make sure that that story was told by the people who were living those experiences most directly. We also did a statewide project around social isolation, so specifically related to the pandemic. We supported about 80 artists across the whole state of Minnesota to design projects that were specifically about supporting communities who were more at risk for social isolation. So you see in the upper right corner there, Pen Pal Zine for Rural Queers. That was a connection project for queer and trans community members who are living in rural places to help them connect outside of maybe the boundaries of their physical place and find community. And then finally, we did a project called Artists Respond Equitable Rural Futures, and that supported a group of BIPOC artists who live in rural places. Again, a narrative change project to help tell a different story about who lives in rural places and whose story kind of gets the headline to try and challenge some of maybe the more dominant media narratives about rural America, especially in the last couple of years. So these projects are all part of a structure that we call Artists Respond, that is exactly what it sounds like, is about how do we support and provide a framework for artists to really respond to the most pressing issues that are happening in their community. So these aren't projects that we tend to plan way out and ahead of time. They're in response to a specific community need. And so I think as you think about this work of creative placemaking, artists can be involved in the kind of long-term planning of a community, long-term, physical capital projects, building projects, parks, other kinds of large-scale community development, but they're also really good at thinking creatively about what their community needs in a moment of crisis or in a moment of challenge, or in a moment when people really need to come together quickly to address a community need. I'm going to talk a little bit about some more specific creative placemaking work. I think, we use a definition of creative placemaking that is the act of people coming together to change or improve overlooked or undervalued spaces. So again, a really broad definition, but one that centers the people in the place. And a lot of our work, a lot of Springboard's work and the work that we support with artists is in these kind of small temporary interventions that help people come together, that help people have better quality conversations about the future of their place. Although I'll end with a little larger scale project. So I think one of the things that artists are particularly good at is helping people reimagine or see spaces in their community differently or try new ideas. So this is a project that was part of a series of projects we did in Fergus Falls in partnership with the public health agency there, Partnership for Health, called Year of Play. And this was a small parklet that was created in a parking lot in downtown Fergus Falls that was both this opportunity for people to come together in a small green space, but was also an opportunity for the community to test out what it would look like if this parking lot went away. As I'm sure you have all experienced, one of the hottest button topics you can engage with in any community, large or small, is parking. And so part of this project really was helping people test out the idea of giving up this parking in favor of a different kind of community asset. And sometimes that kind of process of testing or iteration can be really useful instead of just asking a community to change overnight or give up something that has seemed important and without really understanding the value of what might come in its place. This is another project from Year of Play, and I think such a good Minnesota, Upper Midwest project. Artists are so good at helping us find the assets that we might have overlooked or help us see the beauty in things that sometimes might feel heavy or hard about the place where we live. So this is a Frozen Cinema project. It was a movie night on the middle of Frozen Lake Alice in Fergus Falls. They also served popsicles just to make sure everyone was extra chilly. But this is, the middle of a frozen lake that except for ice fishing, we might not use at all in the winter, but became this real community gathering space, and a space that I think felt special and fun, again, in a temporary way, and in a way that helps people celebrate where they are and feel connected to their neighbors at a time when a lot of us stay indoors. Another way that I think artists can really show up for their community is helping to engage parts of the community that might not otherwise feel welcome or like a community input process is for them. I think we've all experienced the kind of typical community engagement process for municipal or city or neighborhood issues, where you say we're having a community input session and it's hosted sometimes in a church basement with a few cookies and some warm Pepsi, and usually attracts the same people who always come to community input sessions, who often are, end up then playing an outsized role in the input that gets collected. So how do you bring new people into that process? How do you bring residents that might be newer to the community, or people who might have language barriers or have barriers around childcare or their job in terms of participating? Art can be a really effective way of creating the opportunity for people to engage and provide input. These are all examples of projects that are on a roster we run called Ready Go, that are mobile community engagement projects that essentially are as easy to rent as a bounce house. So these are also good examples of projects that don't need to be created from scratch. These artists already have a mobile park in a trailer, a street corner letterpress, that you can just be in touch with them and essentially rent the project to come to your community event. They help attract people and attention. They help provide new ways for people to engage and provide input or answer questions that you might have about community planning process. And speaking of community planning, one of the most exciting things we've done in the last couple of years is a project called Artists on Main Street. That's a partnership with Rethos, which is formerly the Preservation Alliance. And this is a project specifically focused on rural and greater Minnesota communities and towns that engages a cohort of artists in each of those communities, and then resources them and sets them on a set of community challenges, particularly around downtown revitalization and attracting people and attention and dollars, and making downtown communities more welcoming. So if you're interested in Artists on Main, there's more information about that project on our website. And that has resulted both in these kinds of temporary projects that I've been talking about, but also some larger, more permanent installations of public art, but also installations of public space and opportunities for people to engage, and some very specific, context-specific community issues. This project in the bottom right is an artist intervention that's specifically designed to keep geese off the sidewalk so they don't poop all over the sidewalk. So, sometimes your community issue is a big, thorny kind of cultural issue, and sometimes it's a deeply practical issue that really impacts people's quality of life in a very specific way. I'm going to end by telling you a little bit about a project that's really close to my heart. I'm sitting inside it right now, which is our new space here in St. Paul that has been kind of 4-year and possibly longer labor of love that really, I think, shows off the way these ideas come together. So this is a picture of an abandoned, vacant, used car dealership right in the middle of Frogtown and Rondo, which are two of St. Paul's most racially diverse neighborhoods, and also most chronically underinvested neighborhoods that bear the scars, quite literally, and the legacy of racism and white supremacy in systems. And this was a vacant lot and huge parking lot in the middle of what should be a very busy commercial corridor, sort of a real sort of energy vacuum in a neighborhood to have this kind of vacant space. And this is what it looks like now. It's our new home. We purchased this vacant used car dealership about 4 years ago and have turned it into a space for community and connection and culture and creativity. The story of this space starts 11 years ago. The Springboard did a large project at kind of the beginning of some of the most recent generation of conversation around creative placemaking, called Irrigate. That was a project along the light rail construction. So really working with local artists and partnering with local businesses to help local businesses survive the disruption of the construction. And as a part of that project, we had a party in this parking lot of this vacant used car dealership 11 years ago. And that was the seed for us, this recognition that, yes, this maybe looks like an ugly, huge vacant parking lot, but it's also accidentally preserved public space, and a space that is really located in the center of everything, of the neighborhoods we want to be in, and with such a rich history of culture around it and so many creative people. So fast forward a few years, like I said, we were able to acquire this ugly vacant car dealership and parking lot about 4 years ago. And we took a really unique approach to the development of what has become our space. We held the building for a year and just invited community to do whatever they wanted here. So over that year, the building hosted poetry readings and markets and visual art installations and community meetings and dance rehearsals and game nights and all kinds of art activities, but also really important community activities that weren't specifically around, an arts experience or an event. And from that hosting of 200 different community groups and 6,000 people in our crappy used car dealership, we really learned what people wanted from this space, which is that they wanted it to be green space, they wanted gathering space, and they wanted it to be flexible. So we were able to take all of that information and use that as we worked with our architect to make sure that the space really reflects the neighborhoods around it and the uses, the many uses that people want from a space like this, which are, both really practical and rooted in a lot of the things that Jen was talking about, the economic opportunity of this community, the public health opportunity of this community, the environmental impact of this site. We did a huge project with Capital Region Watershed to make sure that the site is handling rainwater differently. So those kinds of real building block city and community issues are present here. But maybe more importantly is the way that the space is a space for the things that artists are particularly good at doing and that are the things we really need right now. It's a space for meaning making, for people to process the hard things that they're going through, to try and heal from trauma and understand the world around them. It's a place for connection, a connection of neighbors and connection to place and connection across differences. And it's a place for imagination, which is sort of where I started today. But this space and all of the work we do is really about, in large and small ways, imagining and then trying out the world as we wish it was and as we want it to be. Because unless people can see and imagine that things can be different, we're not going to be able to make the scale of change that's necessary for our communities to move forward. So it's really exciting for us to have this space that can do these things and where people can come in and try out their own ideas. And I certainly invite you all to come and hang out with us here at our space in St. Paul or in Fergus Falls, where we also have a lovely downtown storefront. And just as Jen did, I'm going to end with a few resources for you going forward. Springboard does this work in our communities, but we're also really care a lot about sharing the ideas from the work and helping other people develop ecosystems of support for artists and for this kind of work in their own communities. In a couple ways we do that. We host a monthly training called Art Train. That's a training both for artists and for city agency and community development leaders around working with artists in community development. It's over the last year specifically focused on helping folks use infrastructure dollars, helping folks access American Rescue Plan dollars to do this kind of creative placemaking work. There are a variety, and then there are a variety of resources available on our websites, including those toolkits, the workbook for artists working in community, and a lot of other toolkits. We try and take everything that we do in our local and place-based work and translate it into tools that other people can pick up and use. And of course, we're always open to having a conversation or talking or answering questions for folks as well. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now, and I think we have time for some conversation with all of you now that you've listened to us talk for a while.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much to you both. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us virtually today, and all the information that you shared. A couple things that I just wanted to note, St. Croix Valley Foundation, with that lovely vision diagram that you presented, Laura. I think Heather and board, we have some work to do on how we present our vision to others. I just love that. So thank you for sharing that. And another comment, I love the broad definition of art as meaning making. I think that means everyone here today is an artist in some way. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to get us rolling with a question that came to my mind. Both of you talked about process and how important that process is, and also how important engaging community and collaborating is. So what about the pre-process? Someone's just got a nugget of an idea. How do they get the people around the table to bring that idea to fruition? So kind of that pre-process, I've got an idea, I want to get started. What do you recommend? So it's not the same people around the table.
Yeah, I think for us, I think a lot of how the work, the easiest way to get the work started is to gather just a few people, try and reach out to partners maybe that you haven't worked with before or communities that you're new to. And then Springboard's a big fan of an idea we call getting to the doing, which is why so much of our work looks like those kind of small projects. How do you do something small together that helps you build that relationship by actually through action, right? Like through trying things together. I think a lot of times we tend to kind of want to leap to the really big project or to the huge, permanent installation. And that puts a lot of pressure on the relationships and on the people, and to make sure that you've included all the voices that need to be there. So how do you actually start with something smaller that helps people practice working together, that can be a tool you use to draw new people into the conversation, or to find the other leaders in the community that you might not have been connected to, and let it kind of grow from there, rather than trying to kind of leap ahead to needing everything to be kind of perfect before you take anything on.
Yeah, I like that testing and iteration that you spoke of earlier. Start small, get people invested, and then go from there. Thank you. A question that came in from our good friend, Judy Freund. Could either of you speak to the integration of arts and environment in the sense of valuing environmental spaces?
I'm happy to, that's a great question. And I think that we're seeing more and more projects coming into the agency with artists really passionate about that intersection of arts and environment, and putting in place ways in which they can communicate these big sticky ideas in complex ways to galvanize the local community around actually moving towards solutions. So one project that we're funding in Plaquemines Parish, and I may have mispronounced that, in Louisiana, is an artist in residence who is an artist and a biologist and an educator who's really facilitating a series of participatory art making activities that directly respond to the community threats around rising sea levels and other ecological impacts. So instead of, presenting a PowerPoint presentation and talking about sort of the environmental risks and like, hey, community, what are we going to do to galvanize around it? He's doing this in really creative ways to connect emotionally with local residents and begin to sort of build those relationships that are needed so that there could be creative solutions that the community galvanizes around. So I think that's, I shared in the chat, Our Place America, which was a 10-year foundation, lifted up some great stories in the Creative Placemaking Research.org website, where you can really read about a lot of these ideas and ways in which artists are playing key actor roles at the intersection of arts and transportation, arts and the environment, arts and water. So I would just encourage you to seek some inspiration from there too. But Laura might have some other ideas to add.
Yeah, I can share a specific project that I'm real excited about right now in Fergus Falls. Springboard hosts an artist residency there, and we had an artist who was in residence who was really interested in the intersection of arts and environmental issues, named Alo Osberg. And while they were in residence, they worked with the city of Fergus Falls and actually the waste management department there, and convinced the city to buy what's called a precious plastics machine, where you can take non-recyclable plastic and turn it into other things through molding and casting. And so now Fergus Falls is the only community in the region that has a precious plastics center. So it also has this impact of really creating something that is definitional and special, that people can point to and be proud of, and people can travel there to use the Precious Plastics Lab. And we've invited Alo back to do a whole set of community workshops. There are artists who are making jewelry from that lab, and other people who are creating other kinds of tools out of that plastic. And again, keeping that plastic out of the waste stream has its own environmental impact, but I think it's also, and maybe more importantly, about how it connects people to thinking about, where their trash goes and how they're considering what they put into the waste system. And also thinking about what is the kind of culture and identity of their community as it relates to environmental sustainability. So that's kind of new work for us, but it's been really exciting.
Very good. Thank you. And I'm going to try to sneak in one more question before we close. I had a great conversation with an arts organization leader here in the Valley. And by the way, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge all the wonderful creative placemaking that's happening in the St. Croix Valley. There's good stuff happening, and this arts leader is one such example. Started right before COVID, hired a couple people, were well on their way, and then things happen. And he's trying to, as you said, reemerge, reengage, and build a better community post-pandemic. But for those leaders, do you have any words of wisdom or suggestions or resources that you can give them, the encouragement that they need that I couldn't provide?
I mean, this is a great thing that we've been thinking a lot about at the NEA, and how do we push further beyond making grants and building communities of practice to support folks working across the country? Because I'll be honest, I can't tell you how many times I talk to a community and I'm like, you got to talk to Laura Zabel or someone at Springboard for the Arts. And sort of that mutual exchange is so critical and important. We're hoping to do a series of activities later this year in partnership with our Town Creative Placemaking Technical Assistance Program. I know that Springboard does a lot of really great, important work to building that community of practice. So maybe I'll shift over to Laura.
Yeah, first of all, I think I would say, I feel you. It is hard. We've all been through a lot of trauma in the last 2 years, and that's a lot for us each individually to deal with, let alone to try and lift a new or emerging organization in that moment. I think, so first of all, I just want to acknowledge that. And then I think the other thing I'd say is that the work has, for me at least, the work has never felt more urgent or more necessary. And there is, if there's a silver lining to the last 2 years, it is that people are so much more aware and connected to the role that creative practice plays in their life, that it's played in the last 2 years in terms of being able to provide connection to people they couldn't see, or connection to their own culture, or just release and meaning making. And so I think there is a pretty unique opportunity right now where people who are working in city government, in non-art specific fields, are really aware that we need to tap into that kind of collective imagination, and that people, and that creativity and culture and art can be a really powerful path for that. So I think my encouragement would be to reach out to some of the other entities, organizations in the community, and find out, what they're struggling with, what they're working with, and see if there are ways that as an arts organization you can plug into that. Because I think that's where some of the most exciting kind of juicy opportunity is right now, and also hopefully an opportunity to feel like you're not trying to do it alone, that you have partners that are also working on those kind of big community goals. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So thank you, Jen and Laura. Thank you for being here today. Thank you to our attendees for taking the time, and let's stay in touch. And thank you again to our partner and sponsor, First State Bank and Trust. And thanks to my wonderful colleagues. It's so good to see you all, and I hope to see you again at an event soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.